So, you just started using LinkedIn Premium. Now what? Well, on your premium company page, you noticed around 7.5 times more page engagement and 5 times more page views. Well done. And now, new clients are messaging you. All because you're using LinkedIn Premium, which helps you get the business growth you want. Think big, small business. Think big. Start your free trial at linkedin.com/premium small business. That's linkedin.com/premium small business.
This is Rob Long with Martini Shot for The Ankler. There's an old rule for comedy: words that have a K or a K sound in them, according to playwright Neil Simon, well, those are funny words. One of the characters in his great play, The Sunshine Boys, makes this point in some detail, and it's pretty convincing, actually, or at least it was convincing enough that by the time I joined show business in the early 1990s, it was a solid rule of joke making. If you've got a choice between two words, always pick the word with the K sound in it. There aren't actually that many other rules, really, to comedy. The hard K, putting the funny word at the end of the sentence, making sure the setup is clear enough. Pretty much every other rule is kind of situational. I mean, sometimes a joke works because it's exactly what you expect. When famous miser Jack Benny acts totally in character, that's funny. Sometimes a joke works because it's totally out of left field, which is pretty much every Monty Python episode. What we say sometimes is that a joke isn't clean, and we don't mean language, certainly not these days when you can say pretty much anything you want. What we mean is there's too much going on in it and the audience is processing too much to laugh. So you try to strip it down to its essentials, just what you need for the setup to be meaningful, just what you need for the punchline to be, punchy. And when you get right down to it, a joke is a very simple thing. It has only really two moving parts, the setup and the punchline. And if you write jokes for a living, as I've done for 35 years, you learn that the basic rule of comedy is that if a joke isn't working, there are really only two ways to fix it. You can fiddle with the setup, or you can tinker with the punchline, but that's about it. My first job in show business, and pretty much my first job in life, actually, I was a staff writer on the long-running hit sitcom Cheers, which is where I learned about setups and jokes. Cheers had a long-running joke staple we called the norm entrance, which was essentially the already simple joke structure whittled to a Zen kind of purity. The format of a norm entrance was always the same, and if you were a fan of the show, you probably know it by heart. Devoted barfly Norm Peterson, played indelibly by the late George Wendt. Well, he would walk into the bar, shout a cheery "afternoon, everybody" to the crowd, and they would respond with a "Norm" in unison, and then someone behind the bar, Woody Harrelson, Ted Danson, late, great Nicholas Colasanto, whoever was behind the bar for that scene, would offer up the greeting setup. Something like, "What's going on, Mr. Peterson?" or "What are you up to, Norm?" or "What's the good word, Norm?" And George Wendt would stride across the bar to take a seat at his usual spot, downstage, stage left, on a bar stool, and time his response perfectly so that he'd be seated by the time the laughs started. "I'd rather talk about what's going in, Mr. Peterson," he'd say, gesturing for a beer and waiting for the laughs to subside. "Cross the stage, quick upstage turn. My ideal weight if I was 11 feet tall. Sit, wait for the laugh. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and I'm wearing milk-bone underwear. Sit, sigh, take his first sip." Actually, norm entrances, they were a pain in the ass to write. Something about the simplicity of the form, maybe. And if you were working on a script, you do almost anything to avoid having to write one. And if you were a writer out of favor, maybe your last script came in weak, or maybe you're just having trouble fitting in, you were sometimes assigned to go off and write as many norm entrances as you could. It was like punishment, like torture. But the secret to a successful norm entrance was that it almost didn't really matter what you wrote, because George Wendt could sell it. With his slow, lumbering walk, his beaten-down expression, his genius for timing. I remember a moment when we were all working on a story. If I remember correctly, it was a long time ago, of course, but I think the script was written by two of the greatest writers around, Ken Levine and David Isaacs. And the story was pretty clean, you could say. The city had installed parking meters outside, which means that Norm needed to keep leaving his beloved stool to feed the meter, which meant that he also had to re-enter, which meant a norm entrance each time. I mean, I think I counted a dozen in the original draft. And as I recall, each one got a big laugh. I mean, how could they not? With Levine and Isaacs and Wendt on the job. But I also remember that near the fifth or sixth one, George let Norm show a little weariness with a running joke. His fifth, "Afternoon, everybody," carried a shade of impatience, like, "We're really doing this again?" And of course we were, because people loved Norm. So much so that if a line of dialogue referred to beer or wives or any other Norm-related topic, the audience would just start laughing in anticipation of Norm's reply. They would laugh, in other words, on the setup. The punchline was already written in their own minds by George Wendt's indelible performance over the years. On another episode, they all run together actually at this point, it was just Norm and I think, again, this was a long time ago, Woody Boyd's girlfriend, and she's at a table close to Norm, who's at his usual stool, and it's just him and her in the scene, and she's sobbing uncontrollably. And he is clearly wishing that he was somewhere else, but he's Norm, and that's exactly where he's supposed to be. So she's crying, and he's looking around for someone else to step in, and his eyes go from the sobbing woman back to the beer in front of him and back again a couple of times, and the audience is loving it. And finally, at the right moment for comedy, which is about a few beats past the right moment for anything else, George sighs uncomfortably and says, weakly, without conviction, "There." Audience goes nuts. Because George's total embodiment of Norm Peterson was so rich and complete, people naturally thought that he and Norm must be nearly the same person. But George was a devoted husband, a true family man, funny and animated and anything but beaten down. And while it is true that George liked beer and preferred to perch on a stool for most of an episode, he was different from Norm in one major respect. Norm was a lovable loser, and George was just really lovable. And here's how you can measure his immense and sneaky comic talent. George Wendt could get a laugh on the setup. Not many people can do that. When George Wendt died last week on May 20th, social media and my email inbox unleashed a flood of remembrances and testaments to George's sweet and gentle nature, but there have also been a lot of clips of Norm entrances and there moments. Each one is a gem, mostly because of George's way of making it all look easy. So let me amend what I said above. There are 3 ways to fix a weak joke. You can adjust the setup, you can rewrite the punchline, or you can just let George Wendt do it. Nobody could walk into a bar like George. If he could see how much people loved him, how much they treasured his gifts, how much they miss him, he would probably wait a perfect number of beats and then say, "There. There, George. There." And that's it for this week. Next week, I will plug a friend's book. For The Ankler, this is Rob Long.